Welcome. I'm Martha Gallagher, your host, storyteller, and musician for this evening's telling with original music of The Christmas Rose. I first heard this story a number of years ago. We had gone to visit friends during the holidays, and one of their family traditions was to go out on Christmas Eve day and cut a fresh tree in the forest. They'd bring it home, decorate it with beautiful handmade, homemade ornaments. And then the lights they put on were real candles. And the glow from those real candles was exquisite, magical. The fresh scent of pine. And their other tradition was to then read a story by the light of the candles. They had several stories that they did every year, but this time they read one called The Legend of the Christmas Rose by Selma Lagerlof. I fell in love with this story, and for days, weeks, months afterwards, I just kept trying to remember the story, and as I did, music came to me. And here we are. So our story takes place in a time that's long since past, in a land far from here, far to the east, far, far to the north, where during the summer the days seem to go on forever, the sun never sets. But in winter, the days are short and the nights are long and dark and cold. This is a land of rolling fields and streams and lakes, and there's a great forest. The forest is alive with wildlife, but in that forest there also lived a robber family. Robber father, robber mother, and their 5 wild and thieving children. They were a rough and wild bunch. Robber father preyed on the travelers on the road that came by the edge of the forest. But when travelers got wise, and there weren't any, robber mother and the 5 children would head down into the villages to procure food and supplies. Our story begins on a beautiful summer day. And indeed, it was a beautiful summer day, the height of the summer. The sun was shining down warm, the breezes were gentle, the fragrances of the fields and the flowers were on the air. Robber mother and her 5 wild and thieving children had left the great forest a number of days before, going from village to village for food and necessities. But they'd robbed those places so many times before that there really was little to receive now. So they traveled farther afield. And when robber mother came upon the village, she descended to the first door. "Let me in, I'm robber mother, and I demand food." And the villager who came to the door, a young man quaking in his shoes, "Robber mother, why do you rob us? We have barely little more than you do. Go to the monastery on the far side in the outskirts of town, for they're reputed to always give food to travelers and beggars."
Now, indeed, Robber Mother had heard of this monastery, and so she decided to take her 5 wild and thieving children and travel just a little farther. And when they came to the monastery, it was a large compound surrounded by a high stone wall. And in that wall, there was a great plank door. And in that door was a very small window up high with bars on it. And that window would open from within, and the monks would pass the bread out to the travelers and the beggars. And Robber Mother went to the great door. Monks, food. Now, Robber Mother and Robber Father and their 5 wild and thieving children had a reputation that spread far and wide. But the monk who opened the little door had never seen her before. She was a large woman, raw and rough. I see there are 6 of you. And he started passing little loaves of bread out through the window. Well, man, I have a husband, and he's quite large and quite hungry. So they passed a few more loaves out. And as he went to shut the little window, Robber Mother noticed that one of her children was tugging at her skirt. The child had run around the back of the monastery while she was collecting the loaves of bread. And she knew when he tugged on her skirt that that meant there was something very interesting that she should see back there. And so they packed up their loaves of bread and they picked up their big sacks full of supplies and they headed around the back of the wall. They walked around. The grasses were high. The wall towered over them. And when they came around the back, they saw that indeed, just like at the front, there was a great plank door. But this door was open. Robber Mother, knowing she wouldn't get an invitation, simply walked right up and stepped right through the door. And she stopped dead in her tracks. She'd never been through the gates of a monastery before. She didn't know what to expect from the austerity of the monastery and from the reputed frugality of the monks. She certainly did not expect what she saw. For there before her and all around her was a glorious garden. Flowers of all shapes and sizes were blooming, their blossoms dancing in the gentle breezes, bees buzzing, butterflies flitting from flower to flower, birds singing and going from the small fruit tree to small fruit tree. The fragrance, the heady smell of herbs rose up, and she saw that there were herbs all amongst the flowers. And she started to stroll amongst the garden. And her children, at first, were as surprised as she was. But then, of course, there were paths in the garden, and they started running and shrieking and playing at this beautiful delight. And at that, up jumped a monk who had been on his knees in the dirt, weeding. And that's why the back gate was open, because he was throwing all those weeds out the back gate. Oh, yeah, you can't be here. Women aren't allowed. You've got to leave. You must leave now. And Robber Mother just kept walking amongst the flowers, and the children continued to play. So the lay brother, being very bold, walked up to Robber Mother, thinking perhaps she hadn't heard him. And he went to take a hold of her arm to gently lead her out the gate. But she dropped her sack and raised herself up to her full height, which was formidable. And she looked him in the eye. "Do you know who I am? I am Robber Mother of the great forest, and no one tells me what to do." You just can't be here, Robber Mother. I know, so please, just take your children and go. "I have no intention of going anywhere until I've seen this entire garden." He went to take her arm again, and she pulled away. And he realized that perhaps he wasn't a match for her. So he left and ran into the monastery to get some help. And when he came back, he had 2 great, strong monks with him. And as soon as Robber Mother saw them and they got close, she attacked. She punched, she scratched, she bit, she screamed, she shrieked curses that I'm sure had never been heard inside those walls before. And her children, hearing this, jumped into the fray. And soon the 3 monks realized that they were no match for this family, and they ran back into the monastery. And as they ran through the door, they ran right into the abbot. The abbot who oversaw this monastery and whose garden it was outside, had heard all this ruckus and decided to go see what was going on. He was an elderly gentleman, bent, somewhat frail, but stronger than you might think. Not a great man, with wonderful snowy white hair and a very gentle face. He said, "Oh, what is going on?" "Oh," said the lay brother, "Robber Mother and her 5 wild and thieving children are out there in the garden, and we can't get them to go. We're going to go get more monks and throw them out." "Oh, no. I'll take care of this." And the abbot headed out into the garden. And we stepped out into the sunlight. He could see across the garden Robber Mother walking amongst the flowers. He'd never seen her before. She was formidable indeed. But he also saw that she seemed to be rather at home in this garden. How could this be? She's a robber. She lives in the forest. She lives a rough life, but she seemed to know the flowers, to recognize them. She seemed to be enjoying the fragrance and seeing the herbs. The abbot walked up behind her and said in a soft voice, "Do you like my garden?" Robber Mother wheeled around on her heel, thinking it was more monks coming to throw her out. But she saw this frail, elderly man with a gentle face. She drew back. "Well, yes, indeed, I do like your garden. When I stepped into it, I thought perhaps it was the most beautiful garden I'd ever seen. But as I walk around, I realize it is not." The lay brother who'd followed the abbot out just to make sure things were okay was incensed that this robber woman should insult the abbot's garden. The abbot had come to that monastery as a young man, and he had worked that garden for many, many years. It was the pride of their monastery, and it was the abbot's one earthly delight. And the lay brother felt almost as strongly about that garden as the abbot did. "Woman, what do you know of gardens? You robber woman. Are you telling me I'm lying?" No, I just don't think, how could you possibly have ever seen another garden and nowhere near as magnificent as this one?" "Well, I have." The abbot asked her, "Where, Robber Mother? Where is there a garden that's more magnificent than this one?" that we know not of. Oh, you call yourselves holy men. Well, surely you know of the garden that blooms in the great forest at midnight on Christmas Eve. It celebrates in all its glory the birth of our Savior. Surely you have heard of this garden. Said the lay brother. Those are just kids' stories. That's ridiculous. But the abbot, hush. Tell me more, robber mother. For I've heard of this garden. I grew up at the edge of the great forest in a village there, and we always heard the stories of this garden. I never saw it. I thought it was only a legend. Well, indeed, I have seen it every Christmas Eve since we moved up into the forest, since we were driven out of the villages and moved up into the forest. Every Christmas Eve at midnight it blooms, and it is the most glorious garden. The abbot was intrigued. He was entranced. Robber mother, when Christmas comes this year, will you take me to the garden? I would love to see it. Huh. I don't think that would be a good idea. You'd probably bring the law with you, and that would be bad for my husband and for my family. No, we won't. I'll bring only the lay brother with me. You can send one of your children to the edge of the forest to guide us in. We won't know where we are. But please, please, please take me to see this garden. And whether it was that the robber mother couldn't resist his pleading, or she just wanted to show them that indeed she knew this garden existed, and she knew where it was, and she had seen it, and she could show them, she said yes. And at that, she turned, called her children to her, and left. Weeks passed, and it was a time when the Archbishop came to visit the monastery. He loved coming in the summer. As a matter of fact, he only came in the summer. He loved wandering in the abbot's garden. It was the perfect place to talk scripture, to reflect on God, to talk the business of running a monastery, to talk local gossip, and to talk politics from foreign lands. He and the abbot wandered through the garden in the late summer, the heady scent of fragrant herbs filling their noses. Beautiful late summer flowers were blooming, and bees were buzzing, and birds were chirping. As they spoke of many things, suddenly the abbot said, "Archbishop, did I tell you that we had a very interesting visit earlier in the summer? From robber mother and her 5 wild and thieving children. The back gate was open and they came right in." The Archbishop was mortified. He knew that the robber family were outlaws and they should not be in the monk's garden. "Well, what did you do?" "Well," said the abbot, "Robber mother was enjoying the garden, and her children were running around, but only as normal children would. They weren't trouble. And when I asked robber mother if she liked my garden, she said yes, but that she'd seen one better." better than your garden? I don't think so. Well, that's what I thought at first too. But she has seen the garden that blooms in midnight on Christmas Eve in the great forest. She has seen it. Robert Father has seen it. Their children have seen it. Oh, surely that's just a story. She was pulling your leg. No, she really says she's seen it. And she's going to take me to see it this Christmas Eve. Well, Abbott, I don't think that's a very good idea. As a matter of fact, I just had a wonderful idea. Archbishop, if God sees fit to let these thieves, these sinners, see his glory in this midnight garden in the forest, then surely we should have it in our hearts to forgive them, to let them come and be part of a community, live in a village. You could give them letters of pardon. Oh, Abbott. No. They are outlaws. And I'm not giving them letters of pardon. But the Archbishop could see that the abbot was not going to give this up. What if I bring you proof of the garden, a flower? If I give you proof, will you give them letters of pardon? The Archbishop realized that this might be the answer. Because of course he could say yes. And of course he was sure that the abbot would not be able to bring him proof of the garden, so he would not have to give them letters of pardon. Yes, abbot, if you bring me proof of this garden, if you bring me one flower from this garden, I will give you letters of pardon for the robber father, robber mother, and all of their 5 wild and thieving children, and allow them to live in one of the villages. Thank you, Archbishop. Thank you. I will bring you a flower. Many days passed. The long days of summer became shorter and cooler, and the autumn was upon them. And then the late autumn, when the frosts came, and all that was left in the garden frosted, blackened, withered, and died. And soon winter was upon them, and the snows fell and covered the garden. And as Christmas drew near, the abbot and the lay brother began their preparations for the long journey to the great forest. The abbot, being an elderly man, and he had not been on a trip like this in ages. But they had horses, and they packed their warmest clothes, and they packed food supplies. And when it was time, they left the monastery together and headed out. And as they traveled across the land, they saw isolated farmhouses, little churches here and there, small villages and great villages. And everywhere they saw preparations being made for Christmas. It had been ages since the abbot had seen this, and it brought back great memories, fond memories of his childhood.
See how the people prepare for the holy days of Christmas. See how the people prepare for the holy days See how the people prepare for the holy days of Christmas. See how the people gather for the holy days of Christmas. See how the people gather for the holy days of Christmas. Traveling from near and far to be together. See how the people gather for the holy days of Christmas. See how the houses are decorated with the evergreens. See how the houses are decorated with the evergreens. Cut from the forest dark and deep and green. See how the houses are decorated with the evergreens. See how the candles burn in the window so brightly. See how the candles burn in the window so brightly. Shine their light into the dark of night. See how the candles burn in the window so brightly. See how the people prepare for the holy days of Christmas.
And after many days and many nights of traveling, they came to the edge of the great forest. And as they stood at the edge of the great forest, a bitter winter wind picked up and started swirling snow around them. And just at that moment, a child stepped out of the forest, just as Robber Mother had promised them, motioned to them, and turned and disappeared under the cover of the forest. The Archbishop and the lay brother followed. It was going to be difficult going. The ground was uneven. There were lots of fallen trees and brambles and ravines. But as they entered the forest, the abbot, who had grown up on the edge of the great forest, felt almost as if he were coming home. He had loved growing up under the shadow of the great forest, and he and his friends had played there. They'd never gone into the heart of the forest, but they'd played around the edges, and he felt very comfortable. And the swirling wind just felt like a welcome of winter. And as they headed into the forest, their eyes grew accustomed to the dim light, and they could see around them trees and rocks. Each tree looks like a sentinel. Each tree looks like a sentinel to me. Each tree looks like it's a sentinel guiding us to the forest. Each rock looks like a guidepost. Each rock looks like a guidepost to me. Each rock looks like a guidepost, guiding me through the forest. The abbot felt comfortable, but the lay brother did not. He had never been in the forest, and its darkness and deepness and formidableness terrified him. And he was sure that the robbers were laying a trap to kidnap the abbot. Each tree looks like it hides a robber child. Each tree looks like it's a trap to me. Each tree looks like a robber child is hiding up there, waiting to ensnare us. Each rock looks like the robber father crouched down. Each rock looks like the robber father to me. Each rock looks, maybe it hides the robber father, and he's waiting to ensnare us. And on they went as the darkness got deeper, and they went further into the forest, traveling slowly, the cold wind swirling around them. The only light was what was reflected off of the snow that fell. And after what seemed like forever, they came to a spot that seemed to be a clearing. And in that dim light, they could see at the far end of the clearing a great rock face that rose up. And they headed across the clearing, following the child. And as they got close to that great rock face, the abbot realized that he could see just the dimmest of a light coming through a crack in the rock wall. And as they got closer, the boy opened what seemed to be some kind of rickety door, and more light came out from the cave within, the robber's home. Oh, for heaven's sakes, get in here and don't let the whole of winter in. Get in, bring the horses. It's a cold night. They'll freeze. Robber Mother had been standing by a tiny, dim, smoky fire in the center of the cave. She beckoned them in, and in they came and closed the door behind them. As their eyes got used to the dimness, the abbot realized that it was quite a sizable cave, and he could see the children sitting around. There was a pot over the fire, and what the children seemed to be eating out of very rough wooden bowls looked kind of like gray dishwater. And over in the far side, he could see a great lump lying down, and he guessed that must be Robber Father sleeping. And then he realized that all around the edges of the cave were freshly cut pine boughs. The Robber Father was sleeping on some of those. But he saw no preparations being made for Christmas. There was no baking. There was no decorating. There was no cleaning. Well, come in and sit down. You must be tired, and surely you brought your own food because we don't have enough to share. Not that you'd want it anyway. And when you've eaten, lay down on some of these pine beds and sleep. I will wake you when it's time. And the abbot was so grateful. He was so exhausted. And he went over to some of the pine boughs and he sat down and pulled out some of the food they had left. He started to eat, but he was just exhausted. And so he laid himself down, put his head on the fresh boughs, and fell instantly to sleep. But not the lay brother. He wasn't going to get caught in a trap by these robbers. He knew they were planning something, so he went and sat close to the abbot. And he sat down and he pulled out some of his food, because he was hungry, and he started to eat. And as he sat there, the long journey came over him. The dimness and smokiness of the small fire came over him. And what little warmth there was soaked into his bones. He woke with a start. He'd fallen asleep. But then he saw that sitting there by the fire was the abbot, sitting amicably next to the robber mother. He thought, I've never seen the abbot look so comfortable, so relaxed, so happy, even back at the monastery. And they were talking. The abbot was telling robber mother all about the preparations for Christmas that they had seen on their journey. And the children were sitting at the edges of the fire, listening, caught on every word. And the robber mother, she was hard at first. She kept her face hard. But as she listened, she started to remember when she was a girl, when she lived in the village, and all the preparations that would take place. Oh, it was so much fun. She remembered the baking of bread, of cookies, all the rich food cooking. She remembered going with her father out into the forest and cutting the greens and decorating the whole home, and the candles that they'd made that burned in the dark of night, and playing with other children in the straw. Oh, she remembered. Robber father had leapt up off his pine bed, and he was shaking with anger, and he towered over the abbot at the fire. The lay brother, whose intention had been to protect the abbot, was terrified, and he cowered against the edge of the cave, afraid of this rough, big man. But the abbot sat quietly where he had been. Curse you! You come here and you fill my wife's head with these thoughts and memories, and my children. We're outlaws, and you know we can't go into the villages. How dare you come into my house and do this? Robber father, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset anyone. I just wanted to share what we had seen in the villages. So I thought they would love to hear about it. And I can curse you. But robber father, listen. I have a promise from the Archbishop that if I bring him proof of the garden, he will give you letters of pardon. Robber father's anger turned immediately to uproarious laughter. Did you hear that, my dear? And robber mother was nearly rolling on the floor with laughter. The Archbishop is going to give us letters of pardon. Oh, that's a fine story, Abbot. I'll give you that. No, really, he will. He's a man of his word. And I promised that I would bring him a flower from the forest. And he promised he would give you letters of pardon. Well, if he does that, then I, being a man of my word, will never steal again. And that's a promise. And as the two men were talking, Robber Mother had gotten up and gone to the door. Shh, hush, hush. I can hear the bells from the distant village. It's time. And sure enough, they could hear just faintly the bells from the distant village on the bitter winter wind. And they pulled on their cloaks and headed out into the night. And they followed Robber Mother as best they could through the forest, where it was dark and deep. They came to a spot here, and they could hear on the wind the chiming of the hour from the distant village. 10, 11, midnight. Nothing. There was nothing. It was still bitter and cold and dark, and everything was frosted. And the abbot hadn't realized how excited he was for this moment, felt completely let down. Oh, what a fool I've been. I thought a legend would come to life. But then there seemed to be just a wee bit more light. And the bitter wind that swirled around him seemed to be just a little less bitter. And then it felt warm, and the light grew.
Feel how the wind changes to a gentle breath of spring.
And there was a shimmer.
Feel how the winter wind changes to a gentle breath of spring.
And a bit of a glimmer.
All is melting now, is left is green.
And a glow began.
Feel how the winter wind changes to a gentle breath of spring.
Sure enough, the snow that had been gathered around their feet had melted away. And as the light grew and the warmth grew, the abbot looked around him. It was a miracle. And yet, as he looked around and saw the snow melting at his feet, he also saw the tips of curled fronds of ferns coming up through the mosses and unfurling right as he watched. And all around as the snow melted, little sprouts and stems came up, leaves opened, and flowers burst open. There were tiny little flowers everywhere, and big flowers with flower blossoms as big as a dinner plate. And the scent that suddenly filled the warm air was heady and heavenly and sweet. And the abbot realized that he was hearing birds singing, and he looked up, and in the trees, from tree to tree, there were birds he knew, birds he'd never seen before, flitting back and forth, building nests as if it were spring. And then animals came out. There was a mother fox and her kits, and they came right out and walked right up to Robber Mother, who praised them for their beautiful coats. And the children played with the fox as if they were as tame as the cat back at the monastery. And there were squirrels, baby squirrels, that ran up the trees and over the branches and down the trees. And there were berries blooming, and Robber Father was stuffing his face as fast as he could with ripe raspberries and blueberries and strawberries. And the scent of these berries filled the air, and the abbot was just in awe. And he felt within him this joy, this inexpressible joy that was growing. This was the garden he had heard of. The abbot was just so overwhelmed by the beauty of it that he didn't notice the lay brother standing just a little behind him. The lay brother did not think this was a miracle of God. Every flower looks like it comes from hell. Every animal and bird is evil. It's just a trick from the devil trying to deceive us humans. I will not believe it. No flowers grew at his feet. No little animals wound in and out around his ankles. No birds flew overhead. No butterflies that were flitting from flower to flower landed on his garment. No, the abbot did not notice this. He was so full of the beauty and joy of what was happening around him, and he watched, and he listened, and he smelled, and he heard. And then it seemed as if everything paused in anticipation. He could feel it. It was like every creature, every flower, every berry was holding its breath. There was a light that seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, a beautiful golden light, and with it there was a warmth, and with it there was music. He could hear the harp. He could hear harps. He could hear singing coming from a great infinite distance. He could hear it, and he knew it must be angels. He was living to see angels. He was hearing angels. Oh, this was truly a miraculous garden, a miracle of God that he was hearing and seeing. And he fell to his knees with a great joy, and the tears streamed from his eyes, and when he tried to open them, he couldn't see anything but just a bright light and prisms of light, and he felt as if a feather had brushed against his face. And he was so filled with the joy, he thought his body would simply burst. It could not hold it all. And at that very moment, up in a tree, there had been a shy little wood dove. And she took that moment, plucking up the courage, and flew down to land on the lay brother's shoulder, the first creature of the forest who had dared to do that. And she landed there, cooing softly, and nestled her head against his neck. The lay brother was sure that hell was upon him. Go! 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 All of you! Go back to hell from where you came. And in that instant, the light vanished. The music went silent. The birds were gone. The animals were gone. The berries were gone. All those beautiful flowers immediately frosted, froze, and withered and died. The cold wind came in and swirled the snow around them, and in the dim light that was there, the abbot, who had been waiting to pick the most beautiful flower, and there had been so many, he hadn't picked one yet. But there he was, on his knees on the ground, and the instant before, his heart had been so expansive, and it now felt as if it were crushed with great pain. And he fell forward on his face, and he grasped into the moss that was freezing, looking for just one flower. He'd made a promise. He had to take a flower back. And he clutched. In the darkness, the robber family and the lay brother headed back in silence to the cave. And it wasn't until they got there that they realized the abbot was not with them. So they took some brands and they lit them in the fire, and they went back out into the forest to look for him. And when they found him laying on the ground, his body was already growing cold. The snow was gathering on his garments, on his face, in his white hair. The lay brother accompanied the abbot's body back to the monastery and gave him over to those whose job it is to prepare the dead. And as they did, they found that the abbot's right hand was clutched tight, as if he were holding something. And when they were able to open it, they found 2 small white bulbs. They took them to the lay brother and gave them to him. The lay brother knew what they were. And when spring came, and it was time to prepare the gardens for summer, he went out and he cleared a special spot in the garden. And he planted those bulbs. And he tended them all through spring. Nothing grew. As summer came on, and the warm breezes and the heady scent of herbs and flowers filled the air, still he tended that spot, but nothing grew. The height of the summer came. They harvested the herbs. They made medicine with the herbs and flowers. And still, nothing grew. The end of summer came. The summer flowers were past. The herbs had been harvested. The fall flowers were blooming. And you could feel the change toward winter in the air. And yet, nothing grew. And as late fall descended upon the land, and all that had been in the garden was frosted and withered, and snow started to lay upon the ground, the lay brother gave up. And as Christmas time approached, the lay brother was miserable. Not only had he lost someone that was his mentor, the abbot, someone he loved and admired, but he knew it was his fault. It was the darkness of his heart that had caused the abbot to die. And even though he was a holy man, this brother could not forgive himself. And when Christmas Eve came, 1 year from when he and the abbot had traveled so far to go to the great forest and see the garden that blooms at midnight on Christmas Eve, the lay brother wandered out into the garden. A bitter wind was blowing. Snow was falling and swirling around. And he walked out in the garden. And then the clouds parted, and the full moon that was above shone its light brilliantly down into the garden. The snow on the ground sparkled like 1,000,000 diamonds. The contrast between light and dark, the moonlight and the shadows, was magical. And the lay brother realized that he was standing right in front of where he had planted those 2 bulbs. And as he looked down at the ground, it seemed as if the snow right there, that the diamonds were sparkling with an activity. They were moving. And then he realized that there was a sprout coming up through the snow. As he watched, it grew and turned and grew taller, and another one came up. And from those came silvery leaves, and from those came buds that then unfurled and opened. Beautiful roses. And he knew exactly what he had to do. He picked one of those roses and left the garden by the back gate to travel the long distance to where the Archbishop was. When he arrived at the Archbishop's monastery, he was shown in. It was Christmas Day. And the Archbishop, being bewildered why this lay brother should travel all that distance on Christmas Eve and through the night to see him, granted him an audience. The lay brother approached the Archbishop and asked him to hold out his hand. And when he did, the lay brother placed the rose in the Archbishop's hand. This is from the abbot. He has kept his word. The Archbishop knew indeed that the abbot had kept his word. Yes, and I will keep mine. And he wrote up letters of pardon for robber mother, robber father, and all 5 of their children. And he gave them to the lay brother to take to the robber family. The lay brother left immediately and traveled the distance into the forest, found his way to the robber's cave. And when he got there, he called out. It was late on Christmas Day. Darkness was starting to fall again. Robber father, robber mother, it's I, the lay brother. Oh, the door of the cave burst open, and the robber father stepped out, angry. He carried with him a large axe. Curse you. You, it's your fault. Robber father, I have letters of pardon for you and your whole family. I don't know that I care. Do you know that last night, for the first time since we moved here, that that garden did not bloom. And it's your fault, monk. It is your fault. Yes, you are right, robber father. It is my fault. And the death of the abbot is my fault. But I have letters of pardon. Well, the robber father couldn't read, but robber mother could. And they both could see the Archbishop's great seal on the papers. So they knew. They had their letters of pardon. Well, said the robber father, the abbot kept his word. The Archbishop, he kept his word. And I will be a man of my word and keep mine. And I'll take my family and we'll move down into one of the villages and be part of a community. And I will never, never steal again. And that's exactly what they did. They left that cave in the forest and they moved down into one of the villages, the one that Robber Mother had grown up in. And it turned out that Robber Father, though some of the skills that he had that he'd used to terrify people for so long, actually turned out to be quite helpful around the village. A small cottage was built for them. The Robber Father had lots of work. The children, they loved being amongst all the other kids and just to have fun and run and scream and laugh and play. And Robber Mother loved watching them. And they had plenty of food. The lay brother, well, the first thing he did was move into the robber cave. And he stayed there by himself, having many conversations with God. And then he realized that he had to forgive himself. For there was much good work for him to do in the world. And he left the cave. He went back to the monastery. He tended the abbot's garden. And with the vision of that midnight garden in the forest on Christmas Eve in his mind, he made that garden even more beautiful than it had been. And he studied the ways of herbs and created many medicinal things and went out into the land and healed people. And every Christmas Eve, Robber Mother, when all the children were sound asleep and her husband was sitting in his chair by the fire snoring away, would take her cloak and wrap it around her and head out to the forest. She had lived there for so long, it didn't frighten her. She always felt like she was coming home. And she would go into the forest, and she would go to where for so many years they had witnessed that midnight garden on Christmas Eve. But it never bloomed again. And while she was sorry never to see that garden again, she loved the garden that was blooming in her home, the garden of her family.
Lo, how a rose a blooming from tender stem has sprung, of Jesse's lineage coming, as men of old have sung. It came a floweret bright winter. When half spent 'twas the night, amid the cold of winter. Ooh, when half spent 'twas the night.
And that was a story of the Christmas Rose. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that it touched you, that it spoke to you, that it resonated with you. I'm delighted to be able to make this performance available free of charge so that anyone can attend. But if you're able and you'd love to, you're most welcome to contribute. And that way I can continue to offer more virtual performances for you to enjoy. All the information is on my website, adkharper.com. Any contributions are most welcome. Thank you. And I'm wishing you and all of your family and friends a very happy holiday.